Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Richie Guerin is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks, that's Alcindor against Bellamy.
Anderson has Jordan. Allen shakes, Gray gets two!
Gilmore on it.
Stop! Oh, brother.
Lead Toledo artists, you get 21.
4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Barry.
Jordan. Open. Chicago with the lead.
Hello, and welcome to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast. I am Jason Mann, and with me, as always, is Rich Kraetsch. Rich, great to be back with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited about this show. It's a larger project from the HP network that we're getting ourselves into, and it's going to be a lot of fun. It's something we've a topic and a book in particular that we've been talking about for a long time about doing something, and it's sort of coincided with an HP project, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah,
how it all kind of came together.
Yeah, we're talking about the breaks of the game. It is part of the HP Big Summer Read discussion, which if you're listening to this and it's still August 2015, you can go to hardwoodparoxysm.com, and it should be right at the top there. A lot of great discussion about the book there, which I encourage everyone to check out and join in if they feel the need. And we, for this prestigious podcast, have two great guests. First, returning to the program is Curtis Hares of ProHoopsHistory.com. Curtis, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
And first-time guest, he is behind the NBA Injury Report podcast, the co-host of that podcast, and also the hilarious Twitter account of the same name. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So breaks of the game, it focuses on the story specifically of the 1979-1980 Trailblazers. They're 3 seasons removed from the title and 2 seasons removed from a Bill Walton injury that one of several injuries, but a final injury that changed the course of the franchise that led to a downward spiral of him missing the season and then suing the Blazers doctors and then moving on to San Diego. The Blazers and their coach, Jack Ramsay, are trying to move on from the ghosts of a championship season and finding what more could have been. And it also tells a larger story of the NBA at the time, dealing with changing power dynamics between players and management, how the NBA has shifted from majority white to majority black league within the last decade and a half, how expansion has changed the economics of the NBA, and how what's going on in the NBA is also parallel to changes in society. And, I think the key theme of the book is that, as progress has occurred, something has been lost, and it applies to both basketball and to American life at large. So this is obviously a seminal work of NBA history, considered by a lot of people to be one of the best books in NBA history. So we'll start with James. James, just kind of what are some of your overall thoughts on breaks of the game?
Well, that's how do I tackle that question? The one, the one thing I thought was, I wonder if this book would be received the same way if it were released today. No doubt, it's an impressive work of reporting. He had a ton of access. But when I was reading it, it had been built up for me. This is my first time reading it, and I'd heard about it for many years. In Bill Simmons' column and outside of that as well. But it had come with such a reputation. Then I read it, and there's great access, there's great anecdotes. But I don't know. I feel like I was expecting the Great American Novel or something. Not the prose itself didn't necessarily blow me away. And I haven't read a ton of sports books. I'm wondering if you guys how does this stack up for you overall? Just very broad stroke. Do you think it lives up to that reputation?
I don't know. Well, I've read a lot of sports books, mostly basketball, but I think this book was one of the better ones because it gave a lot of anecdotes. I have problems with it, but it's great. It's great redeeming value that it does have just tons and tons of anecdotes and just tons of stories for people to read and kind of take as a starting point to have a conversation about what the NBA was like at that period. So I wouldn't take it as like, it's not the greatest book ever written in basketball history, but it just provides like I said, just so many stories for you to like start dovetailing off of to figure out what was happening at that time period.
I think. Sorry. Go ahead, Kurtz.
I guess my big complaint about the book is the lack of, let's call it segmentation. It's just one like gigantic monologue. It just doesn't stop. As someone who got a history degree, I appreciate having like chapters and an index and stuff like that. But it's just like page one straight through to the end. You got to have your bookmark out and pens ready to mark off interesting things because there's no chapters or index to help you out on that.
Yeah, and that's actually what screwed me. I went back and I reread it. I read it many years ago and reread it for this project or whatever, and I forgot that there was no chapters or whatever. So I usually don't read books with bookmarks because I just sort of get to a chapter and then I remember what chapter it is. And I kind of always have liked doing that. I don't like finishing in the middle of a chapter. I have like a weird OCD about that. So for this one, there was like the first time I sat down and reread it, I was like 50 pages in, and I'm like, oh my god, like when do we? Like I was like, all right, like I'll stick with it. Like when are we gonna get to it? And then I was like, you know what? Let me see how long this chapter is gonna be. You do that like it's like the school thing. It's like when you have a school book project and you're like, this thing sucks, like how many more pages or whatever, and then you go through and I was going, I went, oh damn it, all right, so I got to get a bookmark. But that's not a huge issue. But my biggest takeaway, I think, as far as like when you look at it as an overall sports book, and I've read plenty of sports book, mostly baseball and basketball, as far as this one goes, I think, I don't know if it's the best I've ever read, but it's definitely up there. And I think one of the big things that you kind of get with it, and obviously why we're going to be here and talk about this for a while, is that there's just so many characters, so many guys, and the way that it's set up as well is just, it's different than a lot of other sports books you're going to see in terms of you're just getting so much thrown at you, which is good and bad. I mean, sometimes it's a little overwhelming, but at the same time, I mean, other sports books will focus on a team, and yeah, you'll get through a few of the guys, and then that's it. But it'll mostly talk about that team and those guys and in that moment or whatever, and that's sort of, you get the idea that Breaks of the Game is just that, where it talks about this Blazers. But then when you read every single guy, and they basically do the life story of like almost every single guy that's a major player on the team, coaching staff, players, guys, freaking equipment managers, trainers, like, stuff like that. So when you take that into account, and the fact that he's got all these things, coming together and coming into one giant book, I mean, it's from that standpoint of like a literary, what he was able to do to kind of weave these stories in together and how he, put them together, I think makes it pretty incredible. I don't think I don't know if I could say it's my favorite sports book I've ever read, but it's certainly up there as far as sports books. I don't think, it's like not the Great American Novel or anything like that, but
right.
it's certainly up there in terms of like sports books, because a lot of times sports can be very hyper focused, very on one thing. This was a large work. This was a lot of stuff, coming at you in 400 pages or whatever it is.
If I could jump back in just for 1 second, I thought the decision to make it chapterless was really smart, and I thought it echoed this long slog of the regular season that he keys in on over and over again, the 82-game season, and how it's a new thing and how it's destroying the players and it's too much for anyone to get through. Like, I thought the form of it was like very consciously kind of, it was written that way to almost be overwhelming. And then I did like the backstories just because it almost reminded me of Lost. Like, you meet all these characters and then you slowly, I don't know if you guys have seen that show. I don't want to take us too far afield, but then you get the backstory for everyone, like kind of little by little. It keeps you engaged. It gives you like just enough, and then like pulls back, and then comes back to them later. So I thought the way he structured the book was actually one of the better elements of it for me.
Yeah, I think the book, like, I didn't necessarily have the same sort of issue like with the structure. But I can see where you're coming from, and it's sometimes nice to have it be organized a little bit more. But I mean, it's I think it makes it somewhat more of an imposing read than it needs to be, because I do think like it's actually a pretty fairly easy to read book. It's not it's sparse, but still well put. It's well written. It's engaging. It's not the most beautiful prose, but it's certainly well done. So, but I do think maybe that sort of makes it feel bigger than it is. I mean, obviously a long book, and there's a lot of good stories, and he brings. I mean, I think he does a real good job of capturing, the large scale of what's happening in the league. I mean, obviously the Blazers or former Blazers are the the main characters of the story, but there certainly is there's a lot more talked about than that. I mean, there's kind of the aftermath of the ABA. There's the evolution of the players union. There's the history of national TV growth. Even a little bit about Bird and Magic as rookies. I mean, there's Marvin Barnes, Moses Malone. There's a lot of good stuff going on. So, kind of getting into some of the key personalities of the book. I think the central figure is Bill Walton, who was, of course, the centerpiece of that Trailblazers team. Just, an incredible center with superbly skilled, but dealt with injuries throughout most of his career that really prevented him from, reaching even, a percentage of really what he could, other than a couple of great seasons and then kind of a late rebirth with the Celtics as a role player. Just didn't have what he could, but just the incredible court vision, the passing, the shot blocking, playmaking was just for a brief time was arguably maybe the best center in the NBA. Although I think there's definitely that's sort of said and without. I think there's a couple other guys who in the league at that point who definitely had maybe even a stronger case than Walton, but he's certainly in that conversation. And I think there's a lot of interesting things about him, kind of the also having the being a radical liberal, maybe he's at least compared to the button down NBA, he was a hippie. He was a vegetarian. When these things were much more unusual than they are today. And I think the way that it kind of portrays him relating to his teammates and the way that it kind of portrays the locker room dynamics of Jack Ramsay being pretty stern, kind of being a taskmaster, yet in subtle ways, ceding things to Walton, and how that kind of drove a wedge between Walton and the team, and then sort of led to, once Walton felt betrayed by the medical staff and feeling questioned by teammates, leading to him, driving a wedge between those guys. So, Kurt, I'll start with you. What did you kind of think about the way that Walton was portrayed here?
I find Walton's story pretty interesting just because, like you said, this guy that's, very liberal, the hippie, long hair, still goes to Grateful Dead concerts. But, it's this free-spirited guy, but he's clearly got all this talent, and he's the best player on the team. So it's like this, you get this kind of expectation and swagger when you're the best player on the team, like things are going to be run your way. Which that kind of runs counter to being a hippie and the free spirited type, because you want everybody to fall in line in what you're doing. So I think that might be a kind of like the starting point for his like friction with the teammates, because after he got the injury, the teammates were ready to like pounce and say like, well, is he faking it, or is it not that bad, or should he be out there playing? Why isn't he like toughing it out or anything like that? So I think that left this idea of him, what he wanted to see himself as, ran counter to the talent that he had, and his teammates, were just, as I said, just quick to pick up on this fact that he wasn't. It's just this complex thing. I'm having a hard time expressing it, but it's just the amount of talent that he had, and his leftist ideas. Just, I feel like there's just like intrinsic conflict between those two things. Like if you're that talented, you can't be like egalitarian on a basketball court to the purest degree and have everybody follow the line and love you, especially when your foot gets hurt, you can't play anymore, and the thing just falls apart as it did in the book.
Yeah, Walton's story for me was just like, it was just super dark. Like he had to wind up, I mean, obviously the career cut short is the obvious thing, but then he had to like basically go against everything that he purportedly stood for at some point. Like there's the whole part about how he didn't want to take shots. he thought it was, betraying like the signals that his body was telling him, which is true. You're in pain. Your body's telling you to stop. So he didn't want to do that. Winds up doing that. The whole he becomes a born again capitalist thing was like super dark. Like he like how much was he like searching for some meaning in life that maybe had been stripped from him when because he'd already been suffering with his foot injuries for a while, and they have this whole section about how he goes to San Diego and starts wearing suits and talking about being a capitalist, and on a very minor level, having to ditch his beloved vegetarianism to gain some weight to put on muscle was, I thought, a little sad as well. So it really like ran the gamut of like things he had to give up in order to like pursue this one dream of his, which I guess was partially why Jack Ramsay loved him so much, because this is, I don't know, there was a lot of dark themes in this, like, but I thought one of the starkest ones was just like the emotional toll of, what it takes to be great. And Jack Ramsay talking about how he wants people who are single-mindedly, focused on basketball. And from a caring about these people's like soul perspective, maybe not the, best approach to take, but if you want the most successful team, like maybe it is. And what does that say about just like what it means to be successful in any endeavor, but, specifically sports in this case. So yeah, I thought there was sadness. There was a deep sadness imbued throughout the entire book, I thought. Bittersweet.
Walt was an interesting character for me because there were points, and I don't know if you guys sort of got this vibe, and I'm sure where throughout the book, there's times where you sort of really feel bad for him, and other times where you don't, and then it's very weird. Whereas a lot of the guys, I sort of pretty early in their chapter, whatever, their section rather, sort of decide, hey, I really like this guy, or hey, this isn't really my type of guy, or whatever, you know what I mean? Whereas Bill Walton is a guy who throughout, like, I'll read one page and be like, oh, he sounds like a really cool dude, and then like the next page, something will happen, like the boarding and capitalism thing, or you sort of see that he's being, hypocritical as far as how this goes, and he's very weird for me. I never could quite find when it was over, I couldn't really reconcile myself with, okay, do I really think Bill Walton's a good guy or a bad guy? Like, I still don't even know if I know that. And, like, I think deep down he's a good guy, but he did weird stuff throughout. He was just a weird character. I think most others in this book, I was able to very easily say, okay, I really enjoy this guy. I like this guy. And most I did like. I mean, there's very few people in this book that I think I, like, kind of give an eye roll to or anything like that. But he was one that I don't quite know. And I'm not sure if David, that was his goal is to make him sort of a conflicted character or what, but I at least got that vibe. I don't know if anybody else sort of picked up on that either.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely kind of see like the conflict. Like I thought it was interesting how there was sort of the stuff where he tries to be of the team and be part of the team and be friendly, but he's also like ribbing guys who are like clearly like way inferior players and just kind of like almost picking on them just because he could, just kind of being a bully, which I thought was ironic because at the end of the book, there's a story about they're at a Clippers game and they're having like a fan costume contest. It's around Halloween, I guess. And then there's a fan who dresses up like as Walton, but like in a cast and having some sort of sign making fun of him. And then like he ends up winning that contest, and the crowd's like laughing, and Walton is at the game in a suit and just really embarrassed. But I thought like that was just a little bit of karma for the way that like Walton had treated other guys during the game. And I think, Walton's definitely a complex guy. I mean, most of us are, somewhat good and somewhat bad. So it makes sense that he'd be there. I think the two things that I thought were kind of stood out as being interesting for me is when it talked about like his, game day preparation where like hours in, like, he would listen to Dead and he would like actually like picture like actions in the game in his head and and what he would do in certain things, like when he would make the pass or when he would cut to the basket or whatever. And that reminds me a lot of I also, for people who don't know, I also do a podcast about Alfred Hitchcock films called the Alfred Hitchcast. And it reminds me of Hitchcock's approach of like basically scripting out every single action in his head and putting it on the page to where the actual filming of the movie, he already knew everything was going to be happening ahead of time because he had basically all drawn out. It kind of reminded me of that, and just kind of shows like the level of basketball genius that Walton was to be able to just kind of see things that way. And then another thing that I thought was kind of funny which shows sort of the competitive edge for him and just the hippie stuff is days after winning the championship in 77, he ends up playing a pickup game on an Indian reservation against a team led by Phil Jackson. It's just this casual thing, but he's like playing it like it's Game 7 of the championship. I mean, he's out there and he still like has that huge competitive drive even in that environment. And hanging out with Phil Jackson in 1977 seems like a an interesting situation. So.
Man, but yeah, Rich, you were talking about how you didn't know what to think about Walton, and I think I'm like, well, maybe he's just the most well-drawn character in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe him or Ramsay, maybe because like most people, like if you really know everyone's deepest thoughts and what they've done right and wrong throughout their life, like you are going to be conflicted. Like it's hard to say someone is like good or bad unless they're the obvious markers in history of like dictators and stuff like that. So. And we also forgot I don't think anyone's mentioned yet the sad tale of when he turns on is it Coop? What's the name of the doctor friend on the team who he had like given a motorcycle to?
The Culp? I never knew how to pronounce it. It's Culp.
I think it was Culp, yeah.
I forgot his first name though, but Culp.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure we didn't let this pass without.
No, and that's one of the ones where I was like, "Dak, you're an asshole." I was like, "I hate you, Bill Walton." And then like a few pages later, I was like, "Okay, never mind, you're okay." But yeah, that was one of the biggest ones that I really was like, "Oh man, I really don't know if I like Bill Walton anymore." Like the whole book, I was on your side, dude. Now I don't know. Now you're kind of weird, but
yeah,
I get it.
I was trying to see that charitably. I'm like, maybe if you are like one of the best people in the world at something, and it's taken from you, you give them a little bit more slack in terms of how they react. I mean, it's sad, But yeah. I'm wondering, like, how would I respond in that situation? Like, would I lash out at someone? Especially because you lose track because these guys make so much money and like they're so tall and stuff, but they're also young, Yeah.
Ron Culp, he was the trainer. Yes. So yeah, I mean, he ended up being close with both the Culp, the trainer, and the team doctor, who I'm blanking on his name, but I mean, it's hard to kind of. Obviously we weren't there, but it's hard to kind of see where at the point like Walton is culpable for. I mean, obviously he's responsible for his own actions, and he apparently approved all the the painkillers and the medical treatment that they were giving him. But at the same time, I mean, I think this book does a nice job of pointing out the pressures that he felt in that situation, and like the way that maybe. Just the conflict that a team doctor or team trainers would have, being more loyal to the team than loyal to the player. Mm-hmm. And that's of course a problem even today.
Yeah, definitely. That's a huge issue. Like as you're just mentioning that, I was thinking like just the phrase, conflict of interest. It's like you're the team's medical doctor, and you're as just a pure doctor or a medical professional, you're supposed to do what's best for the patient, but if you're getting paid by the team, your other job is make sure that those players are ready to go out there and perform for the team. So if you don't do that in the team's mindset, you're not going to be the doctor for too much longer. So, that's obviously still a problem in the NBA, but really a huge problem in the NFL, as we all know. But Walton definitely is the case of that. It's really hard to say whether he or when he should have had his foot surgery and should have got that taken care of. But, the doctor, he had the conflict of interest too. He had to keep his job and get Walton healthy to play for the team. Otherwise, he was going to be out of there or as close to healthy as possible, I guess we can say, or else he was going to be out of there.
Sure. And it's possible to care about both the players and the team. And it's obviously just, I mean, it just creates the situation. Even if you're doing it well, you're just facing those tensions. And conflict of interest is exactly right. The other, I guess the biggest star of that, those late 70s Blazers teams was Maurice Lucas. Who came from the ABA to immediately lead that Blazers championship team along with Walton. I thought it was interesting how it talked about the two of them sort of managing to divide their turf before the title season. Lucas kind of serving as the enforcer for Walton and sort of filling in some of the gaps of toughness and rebounding and the things that Walton wasn't necessarily as good at. Lucas, was there to absolutely, be basically the perfect complement to him. And And Halberstam describes him as, and I'll quote, very black, very articulate, very political, a strong and independent man sprung from circumstances that could also create great insecurity. And that's sort of what he's going through during this season. I mean, he is been underpaid relative to his talent for several seasons. Signed a deal coming out of the ABA that, what was not a smart long-term deal. In fact, the Blazers were, sort of, almost forerunners for kind of the strategy of signing players to long-term contracts, but for relatively low money, and then only the first couple of years of that being guaranteed. So basically, they were completely in favor of team contracts. So he's unhappy with his salary, and he's totally willing to push the boundaries of the team, particularly with Ramsay and with management, and it kind of creates a difficult situation for the team to be under, and certainly one difficult one for him to be under as well. And he's constantly under trade rumors as well, so that's kind of the tension that's going on during the season.
What do you guys make of Weinberg in general? I'm thinking about it as it relates to Lucas and like his contract, because they make a big deal out of he refuses to renegotiate, and he says, well, I've never done that in my other business. Do you think Halberstam, do you think he's taken him at his word, or does he think that he just knows he can get away with it? So, like, you know what I'm saying? Like, he claims this is principled stance, but isn't it kind of easier in some ways to just see, like, well, if he thinks he can get away with not paying them more money, that's what he's going to do because he's a businessman.
Yeah, I took it as purely just a business, like, we just don't want to set the precedent, or we don't want to, it doesn't matter that it's not fair. That's the contract you agreed to, and that's the one that we're going to do. I didn't really see it as much more than that. I saw it as something he could get away with as an owner, and wasn't necessarily like compromising his moral code or anything like that. So I thought that's kind of where I stood on it.
Okay. It just seemed to me like he was trying to make it almost like a moral stand. Like, this is just how I conduct business, where, like, I don't think he really believed that. I don't know. I'm very distrustful of anyone who can rise to that level of power and, like, the motives behind anything that they say. So, if it's going to benefit his pocket, then he's going to say that, where, I don't know. Like, that's an easy thing. I just couldn't tell if the author of our tale believed him or not.
Yeah, and that becomes a problem, I think, in general. That's one of my biggest issues with the book, is I sort of feel like he's always almost more on the side of, and that's, to be fair, I think that's not really a hot take, that he's more on the side of the management and more on the side of the coaches and that sort of stuff, and less on the players. So yeah, as far as the story of Lucas and those contract negotiations, whatever, I always kind of take it because it's hard to know who's giving him the most access, because and that's the thing, that if you're for people who do any sort of journalism, you always tend to sort of be, pulled in both directions, potentially if you're looking on a story like that, and maybe, who's ever giving you a little bit more, or making it easier, your job easier or whatever, might get a little more beneficial. But I always felt throughout the book, and especially I think this Lucas situation, I felt like he always sort of seemed to sort of paint Lucas and Weinberg in their sort, or Lucas, in his little camp and his way, and then sort of Weinberg and the other guys in there. I don't know. I'm sort of, when it was over, I still wasn't sure where I stood in terms of that, negotiations and who was in the right, who was in the wrong, or if both were right, both were right. I mean, there's a lot more to it, obviously, but yeah, I always sort of felt like, Halberstam was sort of more pro management, pro coaches, less, not anti-player, but more of the pro coaches, more pro management. But that's at least, and I think you get that throughout the book.
Yeah, I have thoughts on that, but we can save it for later in the podcast.
I thought you would.
Yes. I think we all have some thoughts on that. So, but anything else specifically about, Lucas, how he was written, or, what kind of, as a player, anything that stands out to any of you guys?
I don't know.
Oh, well, now you'll have to forgive me. Like, the last time I fully read the book front to back was like 5 years ago. So I went back and reread, as much of it as I could the last couple of weeks. But I feel like Lucas was in the 1977 finals. I think his role wasn't quite. I don't think it was explained in a completely like thoughtful manner, not just by Halberstam, but by general popular consensus or whatever. Because this was a guy, like you mentioned at the very beginning, that he came out of the ABA, and the Blazers were talked about as like the pure basketball squad, the team that played team ball against like the playground Sixers. And it's like, wait a minute, the Blazers had this enforcer, Maurice Lucas, who came out of the ABA. And the reason why that series turned around is because Maurice Lucas like started fighting Daryl Dawkins and intimidated all the Sixers. So like this doesn't quite jive with the narrative of them as like the perfect team basketball when Maurice Lucas like intimidated the other team into submission. So I feel like that idea wasn't quite expounded upon fully in this book as well as it could have been. Kind of the paradox in the narrative and the actuality what took place. But I guess that's a good way to talk about Maurice Lucas, though, because he was very much a team player, but also marked off his turf. And if he wasn't getting paid his money, he wasn't going to sacrifice for the team. He wanted to get his money. Like the money, his interest came first, and then he would take care of the team. But if he wasn't getting taken care of himself, he wasn't going to stick his neck out for the team in the long run.
And good for him, because they were going to do it for him. Like I thought, the end of the book was great because he goes to Jersey, he starts playing again. He's like, "Oh, I'm healthy." And Calvin Natt's a bust, and I felt like the Blazers deserved it. They completely screwed him. He was worth so much more money than they were giving him, and everyone knew it. So, I don't know. I kind of like the way that resolved, to be honest.
One of the other key characters is, of course, Dr. Jack Ramsay, the considered at the time either the best coach in the game or right in that category. Had the loud 70s clothes with the big collars and the gaudy suits. I definitely think there's very much like the Tom Thibodeau like attitude toward each game of like, absolutely having to do everything you can to win each game. And even maybe sometimes at the expense of the larger picture, just he has the red face, the veins popping, takes losses so hard that he has to work out after midnight or walking alone through the empty streets in strange cities. Also was a big physical fitness guy. And, the other thing is that he had a system that he deeply believed in and liked to contrast it with, systems like guys who didn't fit, guys who were, considered like more one-on-one players or guys who like to freelance and weren't necessarily fits. Like he turned his nose on those guys. He was, like even someone like Artis Gilmore apparently was someone they were thinking about trading for. And, Gilmore's one of the top 2 or 3 big men in the league at the time. And he's like, no, he doesn't pass. So we're not going to do that. That kind of thing. I do think that kind of came to bite him and the Blazers a little bit, with kind of maybe the lacking flexibility, and maybe that limited their options on, who they were able to, even if the Lucas situation was untenable, it limited your options of who you could bring in because, you really needed Bill Walton for the system to work the way that, it did. I mean, other guys could fit in, but it just, it's, I think that was obviously one kind of negative. So Curtis, how did Jack Ramsay come across for you?
Ramsay, I think he did a pretty good job explaining him. He was a hard ass, in mostly a loving way, but he was a hard ass. And you look at his coaching record with the Blazers, which I handily have pulled up in front of me, so I don't get nothing wrong. The team. The worst they ever did was 38-44, and that was the year that Halberstam wrote about, the 79-80 season. So this was a guy that like drove his teams and pushed them hard, like to the max to get to like a 42-40 record or a 44-38 record, when they might have been better off just saying like, well, we got a little, some injuries this year. Guys aren't going to be coming back. Let's just, not tank because they didn't use that word back then, but. How about we just let guys rest up and we'll get ourselves a nice draft pick and kind of try to reload. Jack Ramsay's attitude would not allow for such things. He pushed the team to the maximum of their talent. That's how they got to the finals and won the championship. But part of me thinks like his drive to push the team that hard, like a Thibodeau would, in the long run, like that was not beneficial for the team because we forget Walton. Well, not like all of us here, but like, generally speaking, people kind of forget that Walton, like his major injury took place in the playoffs in 78. 78 when they were playing the Sonics. Like he came back from his previous foot injury that same year, and like he rushed back to get there to play in the playoffs. And what happens? He breaks his foot again. And that's what shut him down for like 2 years after that. So you got to think with a coach that was a little less tunnel visioned, I guess is a good term, a little less tunnel visioned than Jack Ramsay. He might have said like, what's the point of having him come back for the playoffs? Let's just let him rest and come back next year. Hopefully he'll be healthy. And we can make like a better 3-4 year run instead of trying to make this one run this season.
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing that stands out about the 77 Blazers is, I mean, Lucas was 24, Walton was 24, Bob Gross was 23, Lionel Hollins was 23, Twardzik was 26. Johnny Davis was 21. Yep. I mean, basically almost everyone in their core, these were all guys, these were all young guys. I mean, they really could have kept it together and been, a great team for, 5, 7, 10 years maybe.
No, I think it's the youngest championship team in NBA history still. That was really, really young team. So, I don't know why they felt the need to just keep rushing guys back.
Right. And I think, Jason, you mentioned the contrast to Tom Thibodeau and, obviously me living in Chicago and James can attest to this as well doing, running the NBA injury report on Twitter or whatever is that, I thought that. And when you mentioned that, I wasn't quite sure because reading throughout this and I was saying Jack Ramsay reminds me of somebody, but who? I couldn't remember. And it was so close to me the entire time because then when I went to the notes and you said Tom Thibodeau and I went, yeah, of course. Like, duh, that's exactly who of a guy that just every game is like the last game. Like every game is game 7 of the NBA Finals. We have to win this game. We have to do this. And you get this sort of vibe from him, and you got that from Tom Thibodeau, and you get it from a lot of coaches, in the NBA as well. So I don't want to just say Tom Thibodeau, but the contrast of those two, I thought was or the contrast and comparing of those two, I thought was really, really important. And I think it absolutely is something that you see with these guys where. Yeah, you look at potential teams that could have, had longer runs or whatever, and then you look at a guy who's so focused on winning that next game and winning this game or this season and everything that he can't look at the big picture, can't look at that sort of stuff. And I think there are definitely, comparisons of that. I mean, I think Jack Ramsay is a far better coach than Tom Thibodeau is, and well, that remains to be seen for a little bit. But I think right now we can, easily say that. But in terms of that, I think it's absolutely, a great comparison of a guy who just was obsessed with winning and just. In a lot of ways, even though he's a very smart man, very intelligent, was so hyper-focused on winning that next game that a lot of times you do sort of lose a lot of the big picture stuff. And you also get the idea as well, and for people that, in Chicago, we hear a lot about this of Tom Thibodeau's just like he wants everybody to follow his work ethic. Like he's a guy that's just going to sleep at the gym. He's going to be there in the morning, and like guys would have to go to other arenas to practice because they didn't want to be around him. Like they just wanted like one day without him there. And you see that with Ramsay as well, where he can't understand why his players aren't as committed as he is, and it's like he just can't wrap his head around that, and he blames it on these modern players or whatever. It really would be any sort of level and era of players would at some point just be like, all right, like just chill, like just calm down, it's all right. Like, but Ramsay doesn't see it that way. He's got every game is the most important game ever, and it led them to winning, as you mentioned. It led them to a championship, but it also probably led to that franchise and that dynasty or the mini dynasty not having as much success as they probably could have had.
He made me think of two other people from the game today who have long histories in the NBA that we haven't mentioned yet, and to me he was almost a combination of, it was a little Scott Skiles-y. Like maybe he's great at like whipping these guys into shape, but after a couple of years, like might lose them a little bit. And then also it was shades of Phil Jackson with just the adherence to a system, perhaps sometimes to the detriment of, talents that might not thrive in that particular system, but could be of use if you were, just a little bit more flexible. But in general, I just thought he was a man of contradictions. Like I thought it was interesting that, he's this really old school presence, but he has these like wild modern clothes. Like, I don't know, that like speaks to something in his like psychology that I find sort of strange. Cause usually when someone is that like work ethic-y, I mean, it's like a very broad stroke thing to say, but you don't think of them as being like flamboyant in their dress, like usually. Yeah. And then you've got like he kind of has this preternatural ability to kind of see what's happening before it happens. Yet you've got this image of this like the sweatiest coach in all of basketball who like literally sweats through whatever. Like, how could you sweat through dress shoes? I'm assuming he was wearing, right? Like, I've never heard of that before. Like, sneakers is one thing, but like visible sweat through your dress shoes, like that's a tremendous amount of sweat. So I just thought, yeah, it was. I'm not exactly sure what to make of him because he did have a lot of contradictions, but I guess that's also like pretty normal and human. But I thought that was good, a good part on Halberstam to kind of show that he's not just like this robot, perfectionist.
I thought that was good too, and I thought that sort of the rivalry and contrast with Lenny Wilkens was interesting because Wilkens had preceded him in Portland, and then Ramsay came in during the championship year, and people obviously gave Ramsay a lot of credit for doing that, but Wilkens is privately kind of saying, well, yeah, but I never had a healthy Bill Walton either, so there are obviously a lot of factors that led to that, but then Wilkens went to Seattle and then won a championship in '79, and he's sort of more known as a player's coach, a little bit more easygoing, but he's also in the same year, in fact, he's coping with some of the same problems of success that Ramsay's had to deal with in Portland, particularly feuding with Dennis Johnson. And Wilkens is kind of Ramsay is sort of put off. I forget if they specifically mentioned it with Wilkens, but he's sort of put off with the former players being named coaches. Like he feels like, I'm a coach and this is a serious profession. And it goes through his, extensive college career at St. Joe's and having a long time, long-standing coaching and taking it very seriously. Not that Lenny Wilkens didn't take coaching seriously, but it's just like the idea that like a player could just kind of walk in and do it is sort of offends his sensibilities. And so they have kind of a, they don't ever like, talk shit about each other, but they definitely have like a, I like sort of drawing the parallels between the two coaches, even though they're in a very similar situation during the season.
Oh, yeah, I was about to say, it just really sucks what happened with Lenny Wilkens up in Seattle. Like the feud with Dennis Johnson, that's one of the things that pisses me off the most, thinking back on the NBA in that period, because that just – you ever talk about the Blazers being like potential dynasty? The Sonics were also a potential. I'm not quite say dynasty, but they were going to be contenders for like 5 years in a row. But like Dennis Johnson, just I don't know what the hell happened to him, but he just started to hate everybody on the team, and everybody started to hate him. And then Gus Williams, the very next year, held out for a new contract. So what was happening with the Blazers was not unique. There was definitely like players. I guess feeling more assertive about their contract status, wanting to get their money that they felt they deserved, and that management wasn't paying up. So I feel like a almost equally interesting book could have been written about the Sonics from the same season.
So, Rich and I talked earlier, and I think we both agreed that our favorite portion of the book is telling the story of Kermit Washington, who is best known as the man who gave what it was just known as the punch to Rudy Tomjanovich. It's a famous video clip. I'm sure everyone listening to this is familiar and has seen it. But he turns around and without really seeing, he turns around and he punches Rudy T right in the face, and it didn't mean to do so in such ferocity, and it was obviously a chaotic situation, but. He was demonized by the leagues and fans, and even though he is a guy who, and the book goes through it in great detail, and it's a compelling story of him, just coming up and having so little self-confidence, but working so hard to become a great basketball player, first in high school, then in college, and then finally in the NBA when he languished for a few years in the Lakers and was maybe kind of getting to the point where he might be out of the league, but he went to Pete Newell, who was a consultant for the Lakers, and he got some individual coaching from him, and was able to turn himself into a really good player and have a really good career. And then, running into the punch, and then afterward, kind of bouncing around the league a little bit and just looking for a home and at least finding, a pretty good situation in Portland, although, there were obviously mixed results with how the team was going. But I just thought the way that, just the way he comes out and the way that I think this is the most compelling story, in the entire book, and I think just the richest, the most lasting story as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, you and I talked about this a little bit earlier, and he's just, I think in terms of a full story, a lot of the other guys are, they'll have some interesting stuff or whatever, but you get for this Kermit, you get the entire, really his upbringing, and almost nothing kind of goes this guy's way the entire time, so you can't help but be like, man, just feel for him. And then when you realize, and I actually did not, I'd forgotten the story of him, that he was just an absolute nut. I mean, he goes to his senior year of high school, he's still just kind of a nothing. He goes to his tryout, he doesn't do particularly well in the tryout, but the coach is just really loves his hustle. The coach, eventually went on to American. The name's blanking me right now, the American University coach, but he enjoys his hustle. And more than anything, he enjoys that, like, the people that were running the thing were really mean to him, and he didn't care. He just kind of took it and sort of kept doing what he wanted to do. And in light of, those people kind of, eye rolling him and not really giving him the time of the day or whatever. And it's amazing how, how something as small as that is just like, hey, I enjoy how this guy, reacts to adversity, can turn into a guy who, by luck grows a bunch of inches, his freshman year of college, trains like a maniac, starts doing weight training, starts doing steps, just shoots all over the place and becomes, legitimately a pretty good all-around player, which is just amazing considering where he was, at high school. And it seems like he's not really even that much of a purely natural athlete. He's a very, hard worker and had to sort of get to where he got to, it was all effort. So it's really cool. And then I just think his story is just so, because finally once he's got it, it's like, okay, cool. He's finally got his stuff all ready to go. His upbringing was awful. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but of course, if you read the book, you're aware of that. But he's in and out of foster homes, doing all that sort of stuff. So he finally gets it all together, and then the punch happens, and it's like, oh man. And like, he, of all the figures in the book, I just had the most sympathy for, and just felt the most for. Like, I felt like there was so much humanizing of Kermit Washington, where some of the other guys were still kind of these larger than life NBA players fighting over money and that sort of stuff. Whereas Kermit never felt like that, and he was without a doubt my favorite character in the entire book.
I'll second that. And it's not even the punch. I mean, the punch is clearly the worst thing to happen. But the year before, like, he tore his the tendon in his knee, the patella tendon. And like, the Lakers were, I think they had like the first or second best record in the Western Conference. But he gets hurt at some point prior to the playoffs, so he's out for the postseason. And the Lakers, of course, aren't going to win without him. So like, that was the first, like, crap. The guy like worked himself up. He's a 12.10 rebound a game power forward. Then he blows his knee out. Comebacks next year, and then what happens? He punches Rudy Tomjanovich. Just going back and reading this about this, because I've read obviously Breaks of the Game, but also The Punch, the book entirely about Rudy T and Kermit Washington. And it just seemed like everybody knew Kermit was getting screwed at the time, but like nobody was like going to pump the brakes on it. They was like, well, he just got to get screwed. Like, they knew it was unfair how he's going to get punished by the league. They're just like, well, it's like, the public wants his head on the pike, so we're going to stick his head on the pike. It's like the NBA just couldn't stop what was going to happen. It's like they knew it was unjust. Like, the commissioner was interviewed for the book, The Punch, or at least they found old interviews with him. And it seemed like the commissioner was like, Kermit didn't seem like he meant to do it, but we got to make an example out of him for everybody else. And it's like, this is the worst guy to make an example out of. Like, he's one of the nicest people in the world. That busted his butt to get into the NBA. And there were worse players with, much greater mean streaks than him. But, they got off a lot lighter than he did for something that, was, it was an accident. Like, obviously, you throw a punch at somebody's face. You don't want to call it an accident. But, the kind of force he put into it was an accident. And he just got punished so severely for it. Yeah, he comes out very sympathetic because, we see he's getting screwed. People knew at the time he was getting screwed. Mm-hmm. No one stopped him from getting screwed, basically.
So you're saying he's more sympathetic than a Steven Jackson?
Yeah. Pops into the crowd just looking for a fight.
Well, The Punch is, it's really like an incredible story because I didn't really know much more about him beyond that. That's pretty much the only thing I knew about him. And I was just,
right. I was same.
And I was like, I knew he was okay. I didn't realize that he was like pretty damn good. And I was wondering if like, would it in 2015, would it still, with like the 2-second news cycle, would he still be known for that for the rest of his life? Like would that change anything, or is when the results are that extreme, is there no kind of getting around the notoriety from literally like breaking someone's face, off? Would that have been?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I kind of think it would be worse in a sense. I'm not sure the NBA would react to it in the same way. I mean, he would definitely be punished, but maybe it wouldn't necessarily be to the extreme that he was punished. But that's a tough question.
Yeah, part of me thinks that it would be more intense, more quick, and then would kind of like move on to the next thing. And in some ways, it almost would lessen it. Like there'd probably be some stupid meme pictures with like crying Jordan face on Tomjanovich, And I just wonder. But the other thing that was created, I thought that tryout story was like relentlessly insane. Like that couldn't happen today. He just showed up at like an All-Star game.
Yeah, like let me go, and they're like, yeah, all right, you know what? Yeah,
okay, fine, yeah, like.
Yeah, and that's such a story that is such a 70s sort of thing, or early NBA sort of thing, or early basketball sort of thing. I should say early athletics, because now I mean these kids, no kid is just rolling up to a tryout and saying, hey, can I play or can I have a chance or whatever? Because these kids have been in the same AAU team since they were 10, or I mean there's just none of that organic sort of needle in the haystack, diamond in the rough sort of guy like Kermit Washington was. I mean there's so few of that because these guys are just so. I mean if you show any sort of skill when you're 9 or whatever, you're set. And like they're not going to let some 17-year-old who's no, I try really really hard. Oh, okay, yeah, let's let you in or whatever. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So I thought that was really cool about that too, because it's just an insane story that you almost don't believe at first because it's so foreign to like our generation that a kid.
And that's the kind of thing that baby boomers will hit you with. They'll be like, just pull yourself up, show up to the All-Star game.
Right? Like no, that's not going to happen.
No,
that's
not today.
That's what my mom said. It never really worked out. So, mom.
Yeah, well, one final thing on Kermit, or I guess just one more thing on Kermit. I don't know if it's the final. But like I went to American University, so like we would play pickup ball in the gym, and his number is hanging up there in the rafters. So that was really cool on my behalf to see that happen. But I also got to meet him, albeit briefly, because I don't like to hassle famous people. But like I was an undergrad, I was doing my student radio show, and I walk out the radio station. There's Kermit Washington walking down the hallway. And I was just like, oh, my God, it's Kermit Washington. And he asked me where, like, the station was. Like, oh, the station's down the hallway to the left. He's like, oh, thanks. And, like, he's the most soft-spoken, nice guy and, like, huge smile on his face. He was on campus because he was, like, raising money for starving people in Africa because he had some charity for, like, over a decade that did stuff like that. So, like, it's really a guy who was, worked really hard, really cared about other people, still does. And so it's just like, yeah, if only the Steven Jacksons of the world got punished like that instead of the Kermit Washingtons. It's bad. It's just unfortunate karma that goes around. It's like reverse karma. Kermit was the last person in the world that should have happened to, but it did.
He's just the poster boy for this deep, unrelenting sadness of this book. The more I think about it, it's just
what a sad, terrible book. Yeah, that's why I've been depressed all weekend. I was wondering what was going on.
So I think the last of like the major characters, and he doesn't really show up until toward the end, is Billy Ray Bates, who came from the CBA, the minor league of the time, and had kind of I think I read it initially. I think I read this book the first time around the time of Insanity. So I think that just the comparison in my mind, was I had to make that comparison because that's kind of what was going on. And it was never like on that scale, but he definitely, was someone who, certainly Portland was paying attention to. He got some national, TV attention on CBS, and he just kind of, was, for the most part, just a volume scorer, Vinnie Johnson type or Jamal Crawford or that level of player who just was there to get buckets. And he's another guy who just came from one of the most difficult upbringings you could imagine. I mean, working with family of sharecroppers on a Mississippi farm, and then going through the CBA, which was just kind of a crazy league where, insanity reigned, just to kind of be a journeyman there, and then finally, make it into the league, and only be, because the assistant coach for the Blazers had, seen him a couple years before and had been impressed by him, and then, they gave him a shot, and then suddenly, it didn't last very long. He only was on the Blazers for a couple years and bounced around the NBA, and managed to find a fantastic career in the Philippines. But but you didn't really last. It wasn't a bright light for very long in the NBA, but was just kind of able to, just sort of out of nowhere bring a little bit of life to this Blazers team and kind of give that season at least a little bit of a happy ending of kind of having a competitive series with a much better Seattle team.
Yeah, and we did a podcast before the playoffs, or actually while the playoffs were going on, these past playoffs, and we talked a lot about Billy Ray Bates. It was like our unexpected great playoffs or whatever. We talked about his back-to-back years where this guy just kind of does nothing throughout the regular season, like literally in a lot of ways like absolutely nothing, and then come playoff time was just unbelievable. Like would just put together these incredible games. So yeah, he does have a very Linsanity sort of feel to him. He's an odd character in this book. I don't quite know how to tackle him exactly. I think they do a good job of sort of building him up and what he is, but I don't know. I felt like there wasn't a whole lot fleshed out with him, and I never really fully got the whole Billy Ray Bates thing, if there was really much there. And that could be sort of the issue. And another thing, too, is because we don't have his full story. When this, as you said, he comes out at the end, he still had an incredible life where he was, a Philippine basketball god, or, he was putting like 70 points a game certain seasons or whatever. So I think knowing that I know that, and then, not being in this book, I think sort of takes a little bit away from the Billy Ray Bates, whereas most guys, you sort of get their entire life and their career in this book, whereas you don't necessarily get that for Billy. So maybe that's why it felt sort of incomplete for me, but I don't know. He was hard to kind of, get a handle on throughout this book.
Yeah, I had a similar thought. I was kind of trying to figure out like what his point was, other than like being sort of a kind of a, entertaining side story. I hate to like boil down like a human's life to that, but just within like the, the confines of the book. But I don't know, maybe it's just like introducing sort of like an archetype of like this kind of person who kind of like floats in and out of the league, and how there's like never any shortage of them. That seemed like kind of like a theme that didn't go explicitly stated in the book. Just this kind of like nothing ever truly kind of new happens. It's all sort of like repetitions of the same kind of issues that they deal with, and like they become bigger or smaller, or they live in different people. But I don't know. I kind of struggled also too with like what the point of his inclusion was, but maybe it was just this just kind of like idea of like of talent and like supreme talent not being enough. I mean, you talk about the title, like the breaks of the game, like so much is like just luck. There's talent, and then there's dedication, and there's so many factors. Like, it's really like a miracle that any team ever can like put it all together to win a championship. And maybe this is just kind of like one small part of that. I don't know.
Yeah, my takeaway from Billy Ray Bates in this book is like it's utterly ridiculous that somebody could just show up off the street. Well, not off the street, literally, but, this dude comes out of the CBA and just drops 25 points a game in the playoffs. I remember when I first read it, I was like, who in the hell is Billy Ray Bates, and how is he scoring 25 points a game? And then I was like, that's pretty much it for the book as far as I'm concerned with Billy Ray Bates. It's like, cool playoff scorer, then he just vanished. But of course, as Rich said, like, he didn't actually vanish. Like, he had a pretty incredible story, just that the book ended like 1980, 1981. So it wasn't there to pick up until 1989 when he's playing in the Philippines. So, yeah, that's not the book's fault, but that's just an issue with kind of seeing Billy Ray Bates' full story.
I wonder if he was a inspiration for Billy Ray Valentine of Trading Places. Follow me for a second. I don't know if you guys have seen this film, but a guy who's not part of the game shows up out of nowhere, comes in, beats them at their own game for a little bit, and then does his own thing. We don't need to spend too much time on that thought, but it just popped into my head.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, we'll have to tackle that.
Yeah.
That's a whole podcast. That's a whole podcast we're going to have to talk about. That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah, anyway. Think about it.
I am, but now I can't think about anything else. You're right. Huh. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. We'll unpack that one another day.
Yeah.
That's
anytime you can bring a Eddie Murphy on a podcast, it's a good day. So.
Yeah, exactly.
80s Eddie Murphy anyway.
Right, of course. Yeah, we're not talking about that.
So there's quite a few other personalities in the book. We obviously can't get all of them, but maybe if everyone wants to pick one more guy in the book who maybe stood out to you as someone who was interesting or worth talking about, or what have you. Rich, I'll let you go first if you'd like.
Yeah, one guy, we talked a little bit about this earlier, was LaRue Martin is one that they talk about a little bit in the book. It's towards the beginning, and, he's the number 1 overall pick, super raw talent from, Loyola here in Chicago. And the big thing with him is that, he dominated in a game against Bill Walton. So everybody was sort of like, oh, what is this guy capable of? And, what can he do? And, he gets there and he's just not ready for the NBA at all. Like, physically, mentally, no aspect of that is ready. You feel throughout the book that he's just a very nice guy that just simply, it's not his fault that he's not, and that's why I always hate when, like, in sports discussions, everybody always like rails on guys as busts or whatever, and it's like, a lot of these guys don't pick. He didn't want to be the number 1 overall pick. I'm sure he didn't mind being it, but you sort of see this guy that's just like from the beginning understands like, oh no, like don't do that to me. Like I'm not ready to be this. And one of the interesting things that I thought was funny is looking at it from the aspect of today's game, and you still get that from time to time. And like a guy like Anthony Bennett is a perfect example of a guy who dominates in some stuff. They see him in some games, they see him in tournament games, they go, oh my God, this guy's so good, and we're going to make him the number 1 overall pick. And he's just not ready for it, and mentally, physically, in no aspect or whatever. But then you also see a lot of, more. I think he's almost a rare case where the team gave up on him super, super quick. I don't know if you necessarily see that quite as much anymore as you kind of did then, where there wasn't the ability to do on-the-job training. I think in one part, a quote of the book is, Martin worked hard to develop, but the NBA was not a good place for on-the-job training. It was an impatient, harsh world where stakes were high and the difference between winning and losing was all important and also surprisingly thin. So I thought is that much, and I guess I'll pose this question to you guys, and maybe that could be the jump-off point. Has that altered or changed since, guys like Kevin Garnett, or since, the prep to pro guys are now the one and done sort of guys? Is there more capacity for on-the-job training in the NBA than there was now? Or is it just sort of depending on where you go and where you land, and it could matter based off that versus, an all-encompassing, idea of how players are developed in today's NBA?
I think it's, I think today you're allowed to have more time to grow into a bigger role on the team. If that makes any sense, like
No, absolutely.
Yeah, you'll get a few more seasons to get into a larger role because you're coming in at 18 or 19 years old, whereas, back in like 77 or even like 85, the youngest player coming into a league would be like 21 years old, because guys might skip their senior year, but they usually wouldn't come out, freshman or sophomore year. So there was just less time in your career arc for them to like wait around for you to develop into something. So now you can wait for Kobe Bryant, who was, 18 when he joined the NBA. You can wait for him to take like 5 years to really grow into the player he was going to be. Whereas, back in 77, let's say Kobe tries to do the same kind of trick. I don't think most teams would have given him the time, 5 years to really kind of grow into the kind of player he was going to be. They probably would have said like, all right, it's been a couple years. We're going to slot you in as like, backup shooting guard. You'll just enjoy that, and that'll be that.
Yeah, I think that, I do think the NBA is still not a good place for on-the-job training. Like, they talk about like that, where like, really like developing skill development is really something that kind of happens more during the summer, working on something specific on your game. I do think that obviously you're more used to there being, 19, 20-year-olds in the game, where that was a very rare thing. So teams were just so used to that happening that I do think there is some more room, certainly, for not expecting a player to be good right away or even great right away. But there's also, there's obviously been cases like, Darko Milicic, who, ends up with like in the worst possible situation with the worst possible coach, Larry Brown, for developing a young player. You just had no interest in that, and just was on a team that had no interest in that. And then, it's unlikely he would have ended up really being, good anyway, because he just didn't, for whatever reason, he didn't really have the interest in doing so, it seemed like. And that was obviously 11 years ago too, so the NBA has changed a lot since then. But I do think it depends on the team a lot. I do think that there is more patience for it, but I do think that it's still a incredibly difficult thing to go from like really raw to being like, really good. It's possible, but it's still incredibly difficult.
Yeah, which makes Kermit, to go back to Kermit, everybody's favorite character from the book. That makes his story all the more amazing, because like he spent the first 2 or 3 years struggling to get playing time. Then all of a sudden he becomes, one of the key cogs, maybe the second key player in the Lakers behind Kareem. So, it makes what he did back in the 70s even more astounding, that he was able to go from, that raw, just pure, like, hustle talent to, kind of a refined power forward.
I did think that was kind of amazing that he had to reach out for help when it was clear he wasn't. Like, I know it's like the pros and you're paying them and they've got to be good, but wouldn't you think it would be in their best interest to, like, have a coach sit him down and be like, look, do you want, like, at least ask if they want, like, some help with, their skills? I don't know. I found that fascinating.
Well, I think that might speak to how they thought of players back then. It's like, well, this one didn't work out. Bad, just throw them in the scrap heap and let's go find another one.
For like off to the glue factory.
Well, and the investment in play, I mean, the financial investment, if nothing else, in players was not as, it was starting to increase, obviously, but it still was not vast to the point where you could just discard a player and you're not paying them that much, so you can just get the next guy in, where if you're, paying them a significant salary, there's more incentive to actually try to make them
a good
player.
point.
Yeah.
And maybe it's because it doesn't seem like first round picks were valued then. They were throwing them in like every trade possible. So
yeah.
So they were just like, whatever, we'll get another one next year. Like, they didn't see the need to develop that, clearly.
Yeah, we sort of take that for granted too in modern team building now. The way we think of it and how coveted first round draft picks are, and top 15 players or whatever. And you understand obviously that a lot of that is progression and scouting and progression, who you're getting. Whereas a lot of times then it was, I mean, you see just a way higher percentage was just terrible picks, because it's just like, teams just, it wasn't a big deal. I mean, it was just sort of, not that it wasn't a big deal, but it just sort of, unless there was that sort of guy that everybody knew was good, you see a lot of teams just sort of throwing away a pick and, let's see how this guy does. Okay, in a year, he's no good. Okay, whatever. Like, forget it. It's over. Whereas now it's like unheard of guy that everybody knew was good. You see a lot of teams just sort of throwing away a pick and, let's see how this guy does. Okay, in a year, he's no good. Okay, whatever. Like, forget it. It's over. Whereas now it's like unheard of. I mean, that's why I mentioned, a guy like Anthony Bennett is almost sort of a rare case these days, where almost immediately they realize, oh God, this guy's terrible. Okay, sorry. Like, and just, they didn't worry about his development, almost pretty much didn't do anything to make him better. I mean, just pretty much realized that it was a horrible investment right off the bat. You don't get that usually. Now these guys, it seems more teams, even if the guy ends up being, a quote bust or whatever, they'll give them so many more opportunities because it's such a valuable asset, and they sort of see it as, not as a sunk cost, but as something, okay, we need to redeem this value that we, gave up getting this absolute terrible player or whatever. Whereas, then it was just kind of, whatever. It's, I don't know if they, I don't know that they, really thought of it as valuable as we do, these days for a myriad of reasons as well.
Yeah, and I guess you had so much more information back then. Like, I mean, it's like, now than back then. So like they see a couple games, he plays well, then he comes into the league. Not everything's on tape. Comes into the league, he stinks. Like, oh, well, maybe he just did stink. How much do we really know about this guy? Whereas now, like you said, you've got all their stats and video going back to like 8th grade. Mm-hmm. So you have reason to like believe way past probably than when you did then, just based on that.
For me, I liked, he wasn't really much in the book because he was basically injured the whole season, but there's a little bit early on, Mychal Thompson, who is of course Klay Thompson's dad. And he would end up being a pretty strong player for the Blazers in the 80s, and eventually would go to the end of the line dynasty Lakers teams. But one that he legally changed the spelling of his first name to stand out to be Mychal. And then the second is that before he was drafted, he spread a false rumor that he was David Thompson's cousin to get attention, which I think is pretty enterprising.
Who was the guy who slept? Who was the guy who slept in and then chartered his own private jet to get to the game?
That was Marvin Barnes.
Yeah, that's basically it. That was one of my favorite anecdotes.
We did a whole podcast on old Marvin Barnes. Yeah, he's
it sounds like that's.
Oh yeah.
Marvin was such an interesting guy. I think my favorite person from the book, probably because all the themes that you could just untangle with them, was Moses Malone. Because we were talking earlier about, the Blazers, being one of the forerunners of, signing young players to long deals to kind of lock them in on the cheap. Except Moses posed kind of a problem because he was a young player, but he had already been an all-star in the ABA. So they're like, well, crap, we're going to have to pay him a lot of money. So instead of paying him a lot of money, let's just trade him away and try to get some little bits and pieces. And they kind of regretted that one because he's one like the 5 best centers ever, but also they lost Bill Walton and they were like, well, shit, that was the perfect, well, maybe not the perfect player, but like clearly like a legit great center that could have just stepped in, and we have to change the way we play, but you can change your way and play with Moses and still be a very successful team. So I found his story really, really interesting. I've always loved Moses. So when I first read this book, that was my first chance really to see a lot more of Moses' backstory coming from rural Virginia, and the assumption that he was an idiot just because he couldn't talk very well. And of course, all the connotations that go along with that, and assumptions that go along with it. But yeah, he mumbles Malone. All right, he want to be high paid too. Oh yeah, let's just get him out of here. Then 2 years later, he's MVP with the Rockets.
He seems to really,
shit, we messed up.
He seems to really relish being judged by that stereotype and just playing everyone for fools.
Yeah.
Like when he was getting recruited by Bobby Knight, I thought that was a great. Was that him? Wait, no, that's I'm confusing that with Isaiah Thomas. Right?
No, he was heavily recruited by Maryland, and I forget the other school, but he was definitely heavily recruited by Maryland. But yeah, he still wasn't a good speaker, but he's a really smart guy. So just because he can't talk well doesn't mean he can't outsmart you. So yeah, he would kind of play dumb eventually and just get the better of people.
Yeah, he acted like he didn't know what he was doing, and then oh, there's a lawyer, and he brought that guy in. He's like, yep, and I'm gonna get a ton of money, and yeah, so.
Lefty Drysdale is the Maryland coach that you're talking about, but yes,
right, yeah,
yep,
yes. All right. So moving on to David Halberstam himself, he was. An accomplished political journalist, had written, several. He wrote a lot of books in his career, but he's just coming off of 2, of his big works. He was kind of at an interesting point in his career. He did tackle sports at times as well. He wrote some pretty famous baseball books, including Summer of '49, and he wrote later a book about Michael Jordan in the late '90s, which I haven't actually read, but my understanding is it's not at the level of this book. I think lacking the access, that obviously the media environment in the late '90s is much different than the media environment in the late '70s in terms of the lack of success of the NBA definitely meant more access for journalists in the NBA because they were desperate for the coverage. So, I mean, the reporting and writing here, I think, are top notch, and obviously, had incredible access, very good research, as we talked about, deeply covered a lot of aspects of the NBA at the time, and really good document of the times. A couple things for me that are difficult. I think there are 3 major things. One, it's sometimes difficult for me to discern whether he's giving his own view of a situation or the view of a person that he's writing about, or some kind of objective view of this is the best truth I can come up with based on everything that I've heard, and I'm just going with that. Also, he has a really, really deep nostalgia for the 60s NBA, before expansion, before bigger money came into play. He quotes originally the impulse behind basketball had been genuine on the part of everyone involved. The product had been good. And things like that where it just I feel like he seems blinded by that. That nostalgia, when I don't think that's really a lot of the things he's talking about in those years of the NBA, I feel like are not really so true. And then the third and definitely the hardest thing for me is the way that he writes about people who are black and who are not black, I feel like are very different. He's more likely to link black players into groups, sort of embrace stereotypes, and I was trying to figure out a way to put this, and I think he's almost like a scientist who's observing alien creatures, and he's trying to understand. He's trying to write them. He's I feel like that's the style that he's writing at. And like he's certainly sympathetic to the plight of blacks in America, and the difficulties that of course the incredibly complicated, difficult history in this country. But he also, like, I think the way that he yearns for the old days in the NBA, and the way he's kind of talking about how society has moved to become more complicated, become more commercialized. It almost seems like he has a nostalgia for the old days, and the way that he favors management in most situations. And I think all those link to just making aspects of the book difficult to handle. So I realize that that's a lot I just put out there, but what are some observations that you guys have, or anything that you want to kind of respond to what I just talked about as far as Halberstam, the way that he wrote the book? You want to go first, James? I'm Curtis.
Oh, wait. I was waiting for Curtis. Right. Yeah, I thought Curtis was going to jump in there.
Same here.
I wasn't going to say a word. I was not going to get in Curtis's way.
Yeah, let's just go ahead and call bullshit on some of things should be like better and easier back when before players had rights and all that.
Right.
And like the game was like the game was more pure, and it was a better product and all that. Like that's just, it makes me so just like, you probably hear it in my voice. I'm just like so annoyed with that kind of logic. It's like players have always wanted more freedom, like more ability to do what they want. Like who the hell wouldn't? Like the nostalgia he's talking about is like the control of owners over players. We're like, people are like, oh my God, isn't it so wonderful when a player spends his whole career with a team like they used to do, like with Russell spending all his career with the Celtics, or Magic all his career with the Lakers. It's like, well, it's probably because in Russell's era, there was no free agency period. So only way you change teams is if you got traded or if you got cut by a team. So then you became a free agent after you got cut by somebody, but your contract was not guaranteed, hence why you got cut. Or in Magic's case, even in the 80s, like, yeah, there was free agency technically, but it still wasn't used all that often. So teams would get the compensation, so it was still like a trade. Like that's what happened with Bill Walton with the Blazers and Clippers. So I think this loops around to Jason's kind of uneasiness with his observations of black people. It's like he has this nostalgia for an era that he thought was pure, but we know, like, well, there was segregation of black people and labor rights were being abused. So how can you pine nostalgically for that kind of stuff? It just really, I think that's where a lot of some of the issues with his writing comes in with the book. It's just his nostalgia for this period that really didn't exist. Like, I think that's why it's nostalgia. It's like this kind of utopia vision he had before like the Vietnam War ruined everything, and then players, fighting and getting free agency began to ruin the NBA. So, yeah, he's got some issues to work out there, I think.
And one thing that I thought was interesting throughout, and I guess I'm curious on your guys' thoughts as well, it always felt, at least from my standpoint, of not necessarily that, I don't know if that was necessarily his opinion or what he thought, but more what he was being told by, whether it was the coaches, whether it was management or whatever. I always kind of felt that was more their voice coming through than his exactly. And I don't know why I think that. It just sort of seemed like there were times when he would be fair and balanced, and then he would get to the, like, sort of the labor relations, and especially labor relations as it related to, black players. And then it would be very much like, oh, the good old days and that sort of stuff. Whereas, I the whole time I just kind of was like, is that, are you just basically being, kind of the spokesperson for the owners and management or whatever, or do you generally feel that way? And I don't know if I ever really got an answer from that, even when the book was over, if that was more his opinion or him sort of relaying what they were telling him and sort of taking it as his opinion as well. It was kind of weird in that sense.
Yeah, it was. I thought, like, largely he did a decent job of kind of like trying on people's perspectives, and I think sometimes he did kind of like talk in this first person-y way that wasn't meant to be his, but then, like, he would have these, like, lapses. The one that kept sticking out to me was, like, he seemed to lose his mind anytime he talked about no-cut contracts. Like, he's like, well, how could they possibly have an incentive? Like, who could ever want to, like, get another contract? Like, your contract doesn't last forever, so you want to be good. You're discounting these guys' pride. Like, yes, like, some people might lose, some motivation, but, like, by and large, these guys get there because they're really good at it. They are really egotistical. They are really competitive. It kind of reeked of this kind of It reminds me of, when people talk about like tipping. Well, we have to tip in restaurants because otherwise they'll spit in our food. It's like, or you could maybe like treat them like humans and they'll be happy to work there, and you'll get your food on time and it'll be hot. I don't know. He did seem in those moments like he seemed to drop the facade of objectivity when he was talking about no contracts, like the most. And yeah, the racial stuff was a little disconcerting at times. I don't want to like extend too much sympathy to him. I do think it can be difficult to talk about like, there can be like broad cultural differences, but he did tend to kind of like always lump in like, well, he was a black player, so like kind of this, and like this is what like black fans like, in a way that was like a little queasy. But I think he tried. I don't know. Nah.
Yeah, I mean, he does. I mean, I think he does bring individual perspectives. I mean, he talks about player rights. I mean, he talks about how he does bring up some arguments about, even talking about like the Celtics. It's talking about, well, the Celtics all loved Red Auerbach and they all loved each other and they built this great culture, even though, he never paid them well. And, he does talk about, I mean, I don't think it's like he's completely taking one side, but I do feel like the weight of the book tends to be like, okay, these guys are getting a lot of money and getting these no-cut contracts, and that's a bad thing. And this game is growing, too fast and too much, and I'm not comfortable with it, and that's a bad thing. I feel like that is definitely given more weight than the other stuff. Although I do think there is challenges to that are in the book, but I don't think they're given as much weight.
Well, yeah, and I think one thing that's important as well is reading it in the context of 2015 eyes or whatever, and sort of knowing that he's talking about this is what's become of the league, and this is what it's going to become, and sort of trying to be a prognosticator on what's all this stuff's going to cause the league to kind of, not necessarily, he's not saying the league's going to go away, but that it's not going to be the same, or no, it's going to lose some of its luster or whatever. And you sort of look and you realize 10 years later the league's going to be immensely popular, just going to sweep the nation. 10 years after that it's going to be a cultural and international phenomenon. And it's going to continue to just be healthy beyond belief or whatever. And sort of knowing that in the context of reading this 2015, you sort of roll your eyes every single time he mentions oh, I don't know about this league these days. Anytime he sort of gets a contrarian view of it, you kind of roll your eyes because you're like, no, dude, it's going to be a super successful league on the backs of the superstars or of the players that are making a ton of so. And another funny thing as well that's interesting, and people mention the HP Summer Read or whatever. A lot of things that he does mention never quite go away. He talks about the TV contracts is a big thing. He talks about the game's become a business and it's all about the TV contracts or whatever. A lot of the stuff is still sort of there, and the league is healthier than ever. In terms of things that at least a guy from that standpoint of an older white man in the 1970s thinks is going to ruin the game, and it's. With 2015 eyes, it's sort of laughable because okay, no, this it's not at all going to happen, and it's going to be perfect. So from that standpoint, I could see how if you read it in the moment, you might be like, yeah, this guy's onto something. Whereas now you read it and you're like, okay, like that's not.
Well, I don't know. So. I mean, I would argue the game is certainly healthier from a revenue perspective than ever, and certainly the players are much better, and there's a much deeper understanding of what it takes to be successful, and we have so much more information. But I think a couple of things he's right about. Like, I do think the 82 game schedule is too long. I mean, everyone seems to. He harps on that a lot. I think expansion is not the greatest. Like, if you took away like 5 teams, like he talks about there being like sub 500 playoff teams, and look at the East, and maybe that's a realignment issue. But you could certainly make a strong argument that if there were like 26 teams versus 30, that like the overall level of play in the league would be a little bit better. So like. He's in terms of like the destiny of the NBA, like, yeah, he's pretty wrong. But I think a couple of the things that he hammers are like pretty right on. Maybe I'm not here.
No, I see what you mean, and I don't think that's ever brought up as like he's very anti-expansion because he thinks it ruins the rivalries, and. The other thing that he harps on a lot about is the idea of like these new like self-made young millionaire owners, and they're in the team for they're being used as tax write-offs. Like, he's obsessed with the idea of like tax write-offs. Like, I feel like he brings that up like 5 times. I don't really understand taxes very well, so I don't know how that all works. But I like it's hard for me to believe that you just buy the team to have a tax write-off. But But I do think I do see what you're saying, James, with the idea that some of the things, they're not exactly the same, but they still certainly apply, that are issues with the league that are, things that are still going on, that are still, like we talked about, obviously the medical stuff and the stuff with team doctors, and, players are still pressured to play when, they probably shouldn't. And it's still a grind for the guys. Absolutely. And the stuff with personalities, I feel like is still there. I mean, I think most of it, connects pretty well, but it is really it is really something to see. One thing that's interesting is there was a Oregon Live blog from the Oregonian where it was a review of the book, but he talked about like a 1980 interview that they had with him about the book, and then apparently like during press conferences, like he would actually be like, he would be with the team during press conferences, and he would like do things like he challenged, the Weinberg, who was, I don't think he was the official GM, but he sort of had the role as we understand it, asking how much money the team made. And then he replied by asking Halberstam how much he made. When Halberstam answered, Weinberg didn't. And then later Halberstam got in a press room shouting match with another Blazers, actually the technical general manager, Harry Glickman, who's mentioned in the book but not really drawn out much as a character. They get into shouting match with each other. I just think it's really like we didn't see any of that like in the book, any of the sense that he's really like challenging management on these things at all, or there's like this abrasive relationship like that doesn't come out at all in the book, which I wouldn't necessarily think like he would mention like the specifics of it, but I do think like if that tension exists, you would somehow feel it there, and you don't feel it there in the book at all.
Do you think that could be the product of? Sorry, you go ahead, Curtis.
Oh no, just based off what Jason just said, I think that kind of tightens up what we were talking about earlier with Halberstam. Seems like he's less pro management as he is like anti no cut contracts for the players. So he's not like in a corner of management necessarily, but he's not exactly in favor of giving players all the money in the world, quote unquote, all the money in the world forever. They need to have like the carrot constantly put in front of them. They need to constantly try to get to it. So I'm like imagining a basketball player with like a carrot tied around their head, like in front of them, like on little like the cartoons. It's like, I just keep going. You're almost there. I just keep going, try to get the carrot. And that's like how he wants the NBA players to be, instead of like giving them a guaranteed contract. So, would have been nice if he had more of his shouting matches with ownership in the book, because we've mentioned it, but yeah, he does a pretty poor job of really separating like, this is so and so's opinion. Here's what I think of it. That's not always clear when in the book as to whether or not he's supporting someone's opinion or whether he's just stating someone's opinion, or when he's giving his own opinion on what's happening.
I wonder if the lack of showing any like hostility between him and management in the book might be related to him being like a working journalist and wanting to gain access in the future with other people, and not having it look like he's at odds with the people who allow him into their inner circle. I don't know. That's just kind of conjecture on my part. But do you think that might have had anything to do with it?
I mean, I could definitely see that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, if you get access with the Blazers, that gives you access to a lot of, the doctor, the players, the management. If you get access to the Portland Trailblazers franchise, but if you get access to Maurice Lucas, you get access to Maurice Lucas. Whoop-de-doo. You're not going to get a very large book out of that. So, not that Maurice was a bad. I mean, he's a very colorful man. So, if you get access to one player, he's probably the best one to get. But it just makes more sense from a business perspective for like trying to write this book. It's going to pay off to have more access to the team than it is to have access to just individual players.
Yeah, absolutely. We've already talked a little bit about, the racial balance of the league. He had mentioned, which surprised me a little bit, but that the NBA apparently as late as 65 was still 70%-ish, white, which thinking about it, I guess that makes sense. But I just that seems I mean, it's obviously relatively recent compared to when this book is written, only 14 years or so. And then by the the 70s, it's about 3/4 black. And it gets certainly into some of the dynamics, of black players staying in Portland, which is predominantly a white city, and kind of feelings toward that. White players, growing up, this generation growing up playing in a sport that was dominated by black players, and how that sort of thing worked. And I think a lot of this kind of comes out in the 1977 finals, and how that is portrayed between the Blazers and the Sixers. The Blazers are kind of like the team that plays the right way and passes, and they're sort of the stewards of the NBA, even though they did have Lucas and Twardzik, who were both ABA guys, but they were kind of they represented sort of that side of things in the narrative versus like the playground, one-on-one, sort of more selfish Sixers, even though they had, Julius Erving, who's just like an incredibly awesome and intelligent, smart and respected and, great guy, who also happens to be just an incredible, just one of the greatest players of all time. And you can do all these incredible things, ducking the ball and so forth. So even though like you can see it, like if you're looking at it like in, you see what people mean when they say that, but it's definitely very, racialized thing, the way that that matchup is described, and even somewhat the way that Halberstam presents it in the book.
Oh yeah, like the Blazers, like they had a lot of white guys on the team, so they're like one of the bastions of like employing white people in the NBA at that time, I guess. I think Maurice Lucas and Lionel Hollins, like the only two like really good players on the team that were black on the Blazers. Whereas on the Sixers, you kind of flip it around, like only Doug Collins, and he was getting older by this point, but Steve Mix, those are the only two like really good white players on that team. So just the visuals, like you look at the two teams, like one is predominantly black, the other one's predominantly white. And there is truth to the Sixers. We're playing kind of more of a one-on-one style of basketball, and they admit as much. Like you watch interviews with World Be Free, he's like, we didn't want to pass the ball, we wanted to just shoot it. Like we wanted to take the craziest shots and take take the guy one-on-one, because that's how we want to play basketball. But the way it got blown up into a larger the right way versus the wrong way, how to play basketball, like definitely have the racial connotations on it that you were just mentioning. So. Yeah, you're going back reading about those finals sometimes gets a little uncomfortable.
Yeah, I'm sure that language was very lightly coded when they talked about it. But it is interesting that like that argument still persists in, I don't know if it's less, like I felt like I was reading, you could have like changed the names and it could have been about last year's NBA finals. Obviously it's like a much different context, but you've got like Golden State with their team ball versus like LeBron just going one-on-one. I don't know what to make of that, but it just, that narrative of, it's impossible to divorce race from it in this context. So like, when you're talking about that team in that year, you have to. I wonder how that manifests itself like now. If people are still using that to talk about race and just using it in teams where like the makeup doesn't apply as well, or if there's room in that conversation for really just preferring like one brand of basketball over another.
Well, if you focus on certain individual players instead of the whole team, you might start to find the coded language there again. Say a certain player from Australia and how he played in the most recent finals.
Okay.
I don't know. Could you be more specific? Andrew Bogut? You're talking about Andrew Bogut.
Oh, yeah, Andrew Bogut. Yeah, man. People are just talking about his hustle, making the most of his talent. Just...
Mm-hmm.
Really showed those guys who just had all this raw talent, but he showed them up. Man, it was great.
And we've talked about that on numerous times. And Charles Barkley, I think we talked about this on podcast. And yeah, it's one of my least favorite things about sports. And it doesn't apply just to basketball. I mean, it's every sport. It goes to baseball as well. This, the scrappy white guy is making the most of his abilities, and the athletically gifted Dominican player is so lazy. And if only he was tried harder, he'd hit 40 home runs a year. But he loafs and he only hits 22. I mean, we see it with Yasiel Puig right now in the MLB or whatever. That's something that just unfortunately has never gone away, and I don't think it's ever going to go away, which is just terrible, because it's really one of the worst parts of like sports coverage and sports media in general, I think, is and as you said, we go back to the NBA Finals. We like to think of ourselves as the super progressive era or whatever, and you go to the NBA Finals, and you have a hustling white guy, and he's making the most of his limited abilities, and whereas
even though he's like 6'4", and
exactly, he's like a very he's like a super he's clearly like a very athletic guy. He's very tall, he dominated college ball, he did it at a smaller school, but but it's funny where you get a guy like a Kermit Washington in this book, and he's a guy we talk about who is a guy that I feel like made the most out of limited skills, and you sort of get that connotation from him in this book, and I think Halberstam does a good job of that. Whereas I've never heard of Kermit as that guy. You know what I mean? That's never the narrative I've heard. The only thing you ever hear about Kermit Washington is that he viciously punched a white player or whatever. And it didn't have to be a white guy or a black, but you know what I mean? That's what you hear about him, and that's what you know about him. And yeah, that's just something that unfortunately I don't think is ever going to leave sports media, and it's terrible. Yeah. It's the worst.
One last thing I want to bring up before we close is it kind of feeds into the sort of the expansion and the changes in the business, was that spent a lot of time on the issues with CBS, and basically the idea that regular season coverage declined to the point where CBS was ignoring basically 2/3 of the team. So there was basically two leagues. One had one was the whole league, and the other was like a 6 or 7 team league covered by CBS, which is basically its version of the NBA. So obviously the Celtics, the Knicks, the Lakers, and then whoever else might have been part of that group at the time. And obviously we still have some of that with just the teams that dominate the national television. There's still a lot of the same types of teams that are dominating the national television, whether they're good or not. But this is very much for me as a kid, because I started watching in the late 80s. And for me, the NBA, this really was absolutely the case. For me, the NBA was like the Lakers, the Celtics, the Pistons, Jordan, and, a handful of other guys. I mean, I was not, aware of probably half the players on half the teams in the league. And I do think that this is I mean, obviously there are so many more outlets to be able to watch your own team and watch your favorite team, but I do think I still think an issue that exists in today's NBA is focusing on the quote unquote marquee teams, while obviously they draw the best ratings for a reason. Part of your growth is to be able to develop the younger players, the star players, Anthony Davis, who's very rarely been on national television. Those guys don't have that opportunity, and that's maybe part of why some of the smaller markets don't do as well as they could do, because they don't have this much of an opportunity to draw in that fan base. So I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think that's always, and you mentioned of anybody growing up and that's sports in general. I think we're focusing on the NBA for the purposes of this podcast, but the MLB is far worse in that sense, where it's almost Yankees, Red Sox, and then maybe the Dodgers, and every so often a team will kind of pop up and go. But as far as ESPN and Fox and those sort of things, I mean, you're basically stuck with those 3 or 4 teams are every single year that are your main ones. The NBA though has absolutely always been that way, and it's got pros and cons. I see the reason why it happens and why it occurs and why it happened even then, and how it propelled the NBA to the heights it did eventually is, it was the Lakers, but it was also Magic. It was the Celtics, but it's Bird. And it sort of always aligns with the stars of the league tend to be in those spots. And you'll get some guys who will be from a smaller market, and for a while they'll show their games or cover their games and do all that sort of stuff, as long as they're a star. And I think that's really the biggest thing that you kind of get a takeaway versus the teams. For a while it was maybe just the teams, but now it's become such a star-focused league that, a team like Oklahoma City, it's unheard of. In 15 years, we're going to laugh at, oh my God, Oklahoma City was on, national TV all the time or whatever. Like, and just knowing that, they had, two of the biggest stars in the league at the time or whatever. So I think that's what it more is. But yeah, it's a problem with the league, and it's hard to ever say that this league. I mean, we say in one breath, we always say, oh, it'd be sweet, if they showed more teams or whatever. But do we really want to watch like the Sacramento Kings and the Detroit Pistons on like a Tuesday? I mean, I do because I'm a weirdo, but like I don't know if that many other people do. Like, I'm that weirdo who like roots for the NBA TV like game of the week to be like the two worst teams that I never get to watch ever, unless I have NBA TV or whatever. So I'm the weirdo that roots for that, but I don't know if everybody else kind of does want to see that. The general population kind of likes their stars, likes their good teams, likes their big teams, likes those markets. So I don't know how you really correct that problem, now or in the future or ever really.
Yeah, I grew up a Knicks fan, so basically the only thing I have going for me is that they did get coverage in the national media, so I can't complain too much about it. But like on a more serious like note, I think, I mean, I don't know, I think that like problem, as much as it still exists, is like really diminishing. Like didn't the finals this past year have like its highest ratings in a very long time? And I guess Golden State is, they're California or whatever, but they're, not the biggest team in California,
right?
And certainly Cleveland, obviously, just because LeBron's there. So like, yeah, like what you were saying, Rich, like it does seem to have like come a lot further toward being star focused rather than market. And just with the internet and League Pass and people having a little bit more choice in what they watch, it seems to have. I don't know. Like, do you think it's like people like growing up in Oklahoma or I don't know, Sacramento aren't as into the game as they would be because of that? I don't know. I feel so divorced from like broadcast.
Yeah, I'm from Chicago. Yeah. I can't really talk to you. I grew up when Jordan was in, so I have no idea. So Jason.
I think it's less of a problem on the local level than it is like, okay, I live in like I don't know. I live in I don't know, whatever. Pick whatever city. Raleigh, North Carolina. I hear a lot about DeMarcus Cousins, and I want to see him play. And like I see these vines or whatever, and I want to see him. And it just kind of like the lack of opportunity there, just like the lack of opportunity for those guys being like on national television and getting that exposure. Like I think there's just some value in getting those guys on TV a little bit more and making them seem like stars by being in premier games. But what you guys are saying makes sense too. And I hardly think it's a huge thing. I just think like, as far as talking about things that still, are, you could see kind of being an issue. I think that's still something that can apply, at least in some ways.
For sure.
Well, one thing my thought on that is, I think the NBA is, they're getting better at it. I think the last couple of years, but they're really unnecessarily inflexible about how they put together their marquee games. It's like the worst situation comes on freaking Thursday night on TNT when you can see it coming like a month away, like, oh god, this game is going to suck because so and so's hurt and this team has gone down the tanker. We're thinking of the Lakers. Like the Lakers are going to be playing this team like it's going to be a bloodbath and a blowout. It's like the NBA needs to schedule like 5 to 6 games every night that they're going to have national TV, so they have the option of rotating. Like, all right, this game's going to suck. Well, let's move it to the Sacramento Kings and the Phoenix Suns because they both might be around 500, but 2 500 teams playing each other. You're probably going to get a good game as opposed to the Thunder beating the shit out of the Lakers because Kobe Bryant's hurt. And if Kobe's healthy these days, you're still going to get the shit beat out of him because Kobe's old and crappy now. So it's like
they did that. That's once last year, didn't they? I remember it being like a huge deal. They were like, "All right, look, we're going to show like this or whatever." And I think it was like Sacramento. I forgot what it was. I recall it doing once last year. What was it?
Well, they flexed the Knicks out of like every single game they were supposed
to. Good, which is not a bad idea.
They should. But you did remind me, they do move all the good games to NBA TV, and if you don't have that, which is a separate package, like at least I don't know everywhere. A lot of times NBA TV is like separate from League Pass. So you pay for every game, and then you don't even get the good one that's on that night because it's on NBA TV. Unless
that
you pay
is true.
Yeah,
that is true.
Agreed.
Yeah.
For people who pay, who do the noble thing, of course.
Right. NBA TV is great. Unfortunately, right now it's showing me a Pacers-Knicks game from the 2000, and I do not like that at all. I'm unfortunately watching that as we're doing this podcast, and it's making me feel even more. You know how you said that this book kind of made you feel negative and depressed? Yes. Well, yeah. Watching these two teams in 2000.
Happy birthday, Reggie.
So, yeah. Oof. I've been watching Reggie Miller for the past 2 hours. It's really a lot to handle.
Nightmare.
At least you're watching them. You're not listening to them. That's a good thing.
Yeah,
That's right.
yes.
You know what? You're right. It is on mute, and I watched an entire documentary interview with him, and I didn't have to hear him say a thing, so it was great.
So, anything else that you guys want to bring up about the book before we close it down?
I just love that the more things change, the more they stay the same, and you see the same stuff repeating over and over again. Especially with the Knicks signing overpriced, over-the-hill stars. That was we didn't cover. Hopefully we got that out of our system now, but I took special glee in that one. I'm like, oh, so they've been doing that forever. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And Portland still has disgruntled big men leaving them. So
yeah,
the more things change too.
All right. So, James, would you like to promote what you have to promote first? We'll give everyone a chance to do that.
Absolutely. Love shilling. So, yeah, I've got a Twitter account, NBA Injury Report. The E in report is a 3. I think you should follow that. And I have a podcast that you can find at that same Twitter that comes out every Tuesday evening. All year long. We take no breaks. There is no off-season for NBA Injury Report. So that's my plug.
And Curtis?
No, I got nothing to plug. Just follow me on Twitter at Pro Hoops History. The website is prohoopshistory.com. All I'm doing these days is just slowly re-editing all my player bios because I'm eternally unhappy with my product. So I constantly just go back and re-edit the articles I've already written because, it's a little obsessive, but that's what I got time for these days.
I've had a couple times where Google's fooled me into thinking you wrote about something, and then I find out that's off. Well, you did write about it, but then it's offline. So I'm like, Curtis,
I'm sorry.
I have to do my own research. Darn it, But yes, but we do.
A good idea. I should put up like a paywall.
There you go.
That's not a bad idea. Yeah,
that's a good idea, actually.
But we get free access. Though,
there we go. Yeah, because we're awesome. You're the podcast, so
Yes, all VIP. You're friend of the site. You get it for free.
There you go.
Yes, we'll even do a coupon code or something on the site.
There you go.
That's business transactions going on.
Exactly. Here. Excellent. Capitalism at work. We are
right. New age capitalism.
They're also born again capitalism. So
right.
So for us, you can follow us at Over and Back NBA on Twitter and on Facebook. Our podcast is housed at hardwoodparoxysm.com. Again, check out the HP Big Summer Read on Breaks of the Game. Some excellent stuff that we could not get into here. You can go to our new forums at overandbacknba.com if you want to talk about classic basketball, because it's a lot of fun. Keep listening to us. We also have our Top 50 project going on throughout the offseason. We're talking about the top 50 players of all time. Curtis has been a big part of that project, which we appreciate. So until next time, thanks, everyone, and goodbye.